Beloved Community Talks.
Well, welcome and thank you for joining the King Center from all over the globe as we continue our beloved community talks tonight around one of the most challenging issues of our time, which has to do with policing. No doubt we are at a crossroads around policing in our nation. What ensued after the George Floyd killing were outcries of defund the police and abolish the police. But in recent times, there have been conversations all over this nation about how do we really reimagine policing. And so tonight, we are going to have that discussion. We've created this Beloved Community Talks platform to address difficult and challenging issues, especially those that divide us as a nation. And our goal is to really have these tough conversations, but from a tender heart of care and compassion, which keeps the ultimate goal of creating the beloved community in mind. The Beloved Community Talks are courageous conversations purposed to yield compassionate, nonviolent action that creates the beloved community. Just so you know, my mom said that the beloved community is a realistic vision of an achievable goal, of achievable society, one in which problems and conflicts do exist, but are resolved peacefully and without bitterness. She went on to say that in the beloved community, care and compassion drive our political policies that support the worldwide elimination of poverty and hunger and all forms of bigotry and violence. And today we continue that work at the King Center of training, creating the beloved community that my parents envisioned via education and training on nonviolence, which we call Nonviolence 365 as the pathway to the beloved community. This year, we launched Be Love, which is a global movement for justice with the beloved community as its ultimate goal. Be Love includes a Be Love training series. You'll hear more about that at the end, and a nonviolence training series. In addition, we continue to call people up higher, because we don't want to just call people out. We want to call them up to nonviolent constructive strategies and conversations, including these beloved community talks. And so these talks help us to get to the root of critical issues and explore those pathways to justice, true peace, which my father said was not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice, equity, and ultimately the beloved community. We are featuring 3 talks on reimagining public safety in America today. I know some of you already may have a made-up mind about public safety, particularly around policing, but I'm encouraging you tonight to just kind of lean in and listen to our guests' perspectives on reimagining public safety. Learn more about the work that each of them are doing. We're going to be talking about reallocation of funds, policy change, restorative justice, reconciliation, community engagement, confronting white supremacist infiltration in law enforcement, to unbiased police technology and victim healing. And so reform, defunding, refunding, reallocation are all topics of conversation for our beloved community talks on reimagining public safety in America. Now, I'm not doing this alone tonight. I'm so happy to have a wonderful co-host, a man that I admire dearly. And I want to thank him for joining me on tonight. My co-host is none other than Bakari Sellers. He's an author, attorney, a political commentator, former representative out of South Carolina, and an activist who has most recently been advocating on behalf of the family of Andrew Brown Jr., who was shot and killed by police in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. So welcome, Bakari. Glad to see you again and to have you join me on tonight.
No, thank you for having me. It's an honor. It's been a day, I can tell you that.
I know it has, and I know you just finished an important press conference, and I just want to find out from you, more about your perspectives on how we reimagine public safety in this nation day, especially now with your intimate involvement with the family of Andrew Brown Jr. How do you see it? What are the elements that we need to really reimagine public safety in this nation?
So first, as you know, Dr. King, but others around the world watching may not know, I'm from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we got 3 whole stoplights and a blinking light.
Wow.
And my mom and dad would always tell me the 2 most important words in the English language are the words thank you, and they're not nearly said enough. And I love you, Dr. King, with all my heart.
Love you too.
And your team over there, I mean, they're just dynamic. And so thank you for always bringing us together and never being afraid to tackle the issues that other people shy away from, or people oftentimes have that tension that your father talked about so much. And they don't know how to resolve that tension or find justice in that tension. You know, for me, I think that one of the things that, and one of the reasons I was so inclined to participate in this is not just that you asked, but the way that you framed the discussion, reimagining the way that we should have policing and public safety. I believe that systems of injustice in this country have to be torn down and reimagined in the image that we want to see. Now, I'm coming to you live from a Hampton Inn in Elizabeth City, just right up to my right. I have to ask for your prayers for Aqeela Sherrills and Gerard Farabee, who are the sons of Andrew Brown Jr., who, unlike many, you know, have had to watch their father be murdered on tape. And today they got an opportunity to watch that tape and watch it over and over and over again. We were looking for what happened in this incident. And so this is something that is a part of, I always tell folk that your father's best piece of writing was the letter from the Birmingham jail. His second best piece of writing was the book entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? And I think that it's necessary that we legitimately sit down and ask ourselves, where do we go from here? This case of Andrew Brown has also taught me this fierce urgency of now. And you asked a question that I'll answer right now. You said, what are some of the things we have to do? A lot of the change we want to see happens on the state and local level. And we have to invest in preventative measures. And that's why I'm glad to be your co-host today, because I want to ask these folks some questions who are on the front lines about how we get to the change we want to see in the world. So I say thank you. I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to be your co-host. I think that the way we'll work it out is, you know, you be Oprah and I'll be Don Lemon, and we just figure this thing.
What a match and a pair! Wow. All right, let's do this. Thank you for your advocacy, and thank you for your voice. Our guests tonight work in the area of leadership, policy, and advocacy as it relates to law enforcement in this country and policing. And I'm delighted to have the chief of the San Francisco Police Department with us on tonight. I had an opportunity to see him on Don Lemon's show, and I said we have to have this conversation with him because he's doing such outstanding work, some work that people probably would be amazed by, because it just doesn't happen from that level of leadership. And so Chief Bill Scott has been courageously and compassionately working for and calling for reform and justice in policing. And listen to that, a chief of police calling for reform and justice in policing in San Francisco and across the nation. In recent weeks, he shared about topics uncommon to law enforcement in this nation. Restorative justice. We don't hear about that coming out of the police department. Reallocation of funds from policing to the pressing needs in communities, and a word that is very difficult for many of us to grasp: reconciliation. And so Chief Bill Scott is joining us now, and I believe he's joining us. Yes. Welcome, Chief Scott. And I told him earlier that we may be related because my mother, Coretta Scott King, is from Alabama, and Chief Scott said he has roots in Alabama. So let me welcome my cousin, Bill.
There y'all go. Y'all distant,
Bill Scott.
distant cousin.
My distant cousin. So Chief Scott, I'm going to talk about something, and Bakari, there are a couple of questions I want to ask real quick, because something just happened here in the state of Georgia, and very troubling and disturbing. And I'm almost certain that there are going to be some other states to follow suit, because the same thing happened when voting legislation was signed here in Georgia, and it just, it's running rampant across the nation now. But our governor just this past Friday signed legislation to essentially prohibit any of the local law enforcement from reducing their police budgets, their law enforcement budgets, by more than 5%, which for many people feel blocks any efforts to reallocate a portion of funding from law enforcement to other critical issues of public safety. When we talk about reimagining public safety in America and this kind of legislation, how does it impact that conversation from your vantage point?
Well, I will tell you, I just my opinion, that is a local issue that should be managed by local leaders. I mean, here in San Francisco, our mayor, London Breed, last year in the heat of everything that was happening after George Floyd's murder, decided to reallocate some of the policing and sheriff's budget to really address the root causes of what's happening in the Black community. And I and this police department supported that. And I think our mayor was courageous in doing so. And please, for your listeners and Dr. King and Mr. Sellers, hear me clearly on this. I don't advocate for putting a police department in a position where they're stripped of their budgets and they can't do what the public expects of us and them, rather, police departments around the country. Because, here in San Francisco, we have several 100,000 calls a year of people that dial 911 because they need help, and we need to be able to provide that service. But we also got to be really smart and balanced about this, and really not ignore some of what's happening in this city and other cities in the Black and oftentimes brown communities, where people actually need help. And I think if we can get to that, then a lot of the calls that we end up going to that are caused by these structural and societal deficits, maybe we get to a day where we don't have to go to those calls. And I think you have to make that initial investment for that to happen. It's a delicate balance. We got quite a bit of our budget taken last year and reallocated, and there was some pain there, but I think it was an investment that I applauded the mayor to make. It was painful for us, but I think it was the right thing to do for that time. Now, we fight for our budget so we can get what we need to. We're going to talk about, I hope, reform, and that takes funding as well. And we really have to look at this with some balance. But I think that should be a local elected official choice that should not be mandated by a governor, because you have to be able to run your city for what your city needs.
Thank you for that. I'm hoping we'll be able to do something about that, because it's pretty serious. If you're talking about not being able to reallocate, that means we have to find other funding above the funding that's already there for these deal with these critical issues. But shortly after the verdict that was handed down in the George Floyd case, you said the work of doing justice for George Floyd doesn't end today, and we all know that. That was one situation. My hope for all of us, and this is your words, in these criminal justice roles, is that we rise to this moment and learn the lessons that history has frankly been trying to teach us for decades. My father, Dr. King, said that justice at its best is love correcting everything that stands against love. When we look at that definition, how must justice for George Floyd and for humanity continue in the areas of policing and public safety?
Well, Dr. King, that's a great question. And, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama, and, civil rights history is rooted in my DNA. And one of the things that I think we all can probably agree to is that we have to acknowledge how we got here through the lens of history. The work of your father and quite frankly, Mr. Sellers' father and others like him that really allowed me and Mr. Sellers and all of us to do what we're doing today. We have to acknowledge that. And I want to try to frame this in how it relates to policing in a framework of a book I read by Desmond Tutu. His book was No Future Without Forgiveness. And I don't want to mess this up, so I'm going to read this quote. Desmond Tutu, he made his point very clearly in the book that true reconciliation cannot be achieved by denying the past, but nor is it easy to reconcile, and I'm going to quote this part, a nation looks the beast in the eye. We have to move forward with honesty and compassion to build a newer and more humane world. Now, I think we have to apply that to policing. Looking at things through the lens of history is very difficult for this profession, for my chosen profession, and we have had trouble doing that. This nation's history is not pretty when it comes to policing, particularly Black people. And it's really hard for some people to wrap their minds around how we got here throughout our history. And we have to really have these honest conversations to really acknowledge some of the wrongs of the past, and not only acknowledge them, but as Mr. Sellers says, where do we go from here? I talked on Mr. Lemon's show and Don Lemon's show about, bringing in, Lisa McNair to talk to our command staff. And Lisa's the sister of Denise McNair, one of the 4 little girls that was killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. But one of the reasons that we did that is the compassion piece and taking a historical story, making it real through the eyes of somebody who had to live it, and that has impacted her and her family for the rest of their lives. And it puts things in a different perspective when you hear from her the denial of justice for so many years before there was even a conviction on that case. And so those type of things have to be brought into the front door of policing so we can put history in the proper context and learn from it. And then we get more recent with all the incidents that we've seen, over not just the Mr. Floyd's murder, but as I said, that's one case. And Mr. Sellers introduced, himself in this conversation tonight about a case that he's working on. So these cases can be repeated over and over and over again, and we can look back in history and see that this is nothing new. But where do we go from here? We have to reconcile it. And we do have to, as Desmond Tutu said, look the beast in the eye, but we have to also move forward with reform. Now, in San Francisco, we are in the midst, we're 5 years into a massive reform effort. And I hope, you give me an opportunity to talk about kind of what we're doing here, which I think can be a model for others, because our reform is voluntary. It's not overnight. We got our own problems in San Francisco with some of the same issues, the use of force and officer-involved shootings that got us to a point where we recognized that we needed reform. But we were willing to look at this department with our own scrutiny and let others look at it and move forward. And that is very hard for a lot of people, but that's the first step to moving forward.
Can I chime in real quick? Dr. King, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, you brought in that historical context, and I think that's so important. And I guess you kind of have to, coming from Birmingham and coming from the Black Belt soil of Alabama. But I do want to talk about some of the things you all are doing about restorative justice. I do want to talk about some of the reform efforts that you are taking. I think it's so important because when we have these conversations about policing, I always talk about my mama and her friends who are the voters in this country, right? And they always tell me they don't want less police, they just want better police, right? And that's usually the conversation that they're having. They're not on Twitter. She's on Facebook too much, but my mama ain't really on Twitter. And she's on IG just to see her grandbabies. But talk about the reform that you are doing. Talk about some of those restorative justice, because me and Dr. King were laughing that we don't really hear restorative justice come from the mouth of police chiefs often, but you're doing that work. So what does the next year or 2 or 3 years look like for the San Francisco Police Department with the justice efforts you're taking?
Well, can I start by, if you will, level setting? I wanted to define reform, at least how we see it here. And I think reform means different things to different people, but here's my definition of reform. Reform is to change to a better state of being, and we're talking about policing. So to change policing in a better state of being by replacing things that are wrong that are deficient in policing policies, processes, procedures, and sometimes people who are better suited to do the job at hand. And that all those things are really what, in essence, our reform initiative are designed to do. And it's our reform is broken up into 5 major categories: use of force, and changing our policies, protocols, procedures, so we can, number one, reduce force, particularly deadly force, officer-involved shootings, and we've done that. But also, in our city, we have an issue with disparity. We have a African-American population here that's very small per capita, and a disproportionate of African-Americans have force used upon them. And that's a problem that we own and acknowledge, but how do we make that better moving forward, to Mr. Sellers' point? And we have specific recommendations that were basically recommended by the US DOJ under President Obama's administration that we are almost done with implementing. There were 272 recommendations over 5 broad categories, use of force being really the one that got us there. But others include bias, and that includes implicit bias, explicit bias, which left unchecked causes a manifestation of systemic and systematic racism. Accountability. Do we do the right thing when officers aren't doing what they're supposed to do? Recruitment, hiring, personnel practices. Who are we bringing into the department? I mentioned sometimes part of reform, you have to replace officers who aren't suited to do this job with officers that are. And part of that is also having a police force that's reflective of the diversity of a very diverse city. And and you look at what we've done over the last 5 years, and we have really done a good job at that. And then community policing, which is the linchpin of good policing. You have to engage with the public and understand the public that you're policing. So those 5 areas cover 272 recommendations, and we got off to a rocky start. And then in 2017, when there was a change in presidential administrations, the US DOJ walked away from this work. And we had to find another partner in our state attorney general to really oversee and look over our shoulders, if you will. So we had an independent partner to keep us on track and keep us accountable, because we also have to be organizationally accountable. And the one thing I want to say too, that with all of what I hear about conversations, both public conversations, a lot of the accountability is focused toward the individual officers. And I think that is very important and an absolute must. But we also have to look at organizational accountability. We have to look at the departments and the leadership, people like me. What are we asking the officers to do, and how are we asking them to do it? And if we're not held accountable to those things, you really can't have one without the other, in my opinion. So I think we got to pay more attention to that as well. And in terms of the last thing, as far as restorative justice and how we have to, I believe, approach some of our issues with addressing crime, we have to step away, and we have here, from relying solely on imprisonment to solve that issue. I mean, we have to do our jobs, and look, if somebody gets shot, killed, or whatever, we have to do our jobs. We have to investigate the case fairly, objectively, and then bring the evidence to our prosecutor, and they do what they do. But also, are there alternatives, particularly for people who, quite frankly, don't deserve to spend their entire lives in prison, or 20 years in prison for carrying a pocket full of dope? I mean, we got to revisit those things and really determine where restorative justice, and what I mean restorative justice, is the victim being made whole by whatever that remedy is, and sometimes it doesn't amount to prison. Is the city where it's happening in been made whole? Is there restitution and those type of things, where we can look at things other than incarceration to have a just society? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. I know there's a lot of work to be done there. In San Francisco, we embrace it. We're open to it, because I think that's the way that we have to go to balance some of how we got here.
Let me ask, if I can, just briefly, what's the morale of your officers like at this time as you're undergoing these reform efforts? Because one of the things people always talk about is officers don't want to go through reform, or this climate. Just talk to me about the morale and how and I'm sorry, it's still in the last question from you. I'm not doing my best Don Lemon to your Oprah. Dr.
No problem.
But talk about the morale of law enforcement officers as you're going through this reform efforts.
Well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, I can tell you that some officers have very high morale and some don't, not so much. And I think there's different reasons for it. Overall, I would say our department has embraced reform. And the reason I say that, and I know this is anecdotal, it's because they're still doing the work. They're still going out every day, despite a very, very tense environment in policing right now, and they're doing good work. Not to say that we don't have our mistakes. We're not a perfect police department. By far, we're not a perfect police department, but they are doing the work, and they're doing some really good work. They're engaging with the community. They're doing the things that we asked them to do. Now, I can't tell you that's 100% of our over 2,000 officers. Yeah. But in reality, for the most part, I see it day in and day out. We have these high-profile cases. There's been quite a few cases with, Asian-related crimes against, Asians. Some of them hate crimes, and we've made arrests really quickly. And let me speak from a police officer's perspective. I've been doing this work over 31 years. My morale was always tempered by, are you giving me the things that I need to do the job that you're asking me to do? And if that answer is yes, I've always been of the opinion, you're giving me everything that I'm asking you for to do my job. You're telling me what I need to do, and you're clear about that. Then let me go out and do my job. And if I make a mistake or if I do something wrong, hold me accountable, but just let me do my job. And for those officers who have that mindset, their morale usually is pretty good. We can get caught up into the news cycles and all the negative that's out there, and start pitting what we do. But the bottom line is this: most of us came on this job for service, to help people in need, and most of us still hold that in our hearts. For those people, I think their morale is okay. Not to say there's challenges, because right now, there's a lot of people upset with the policing profession. But I measure it by, are we doing what the public is asking us to do in the way that the public is asking us to do it? And I think by and large here in San Francisco, that answer is yes. And that's where we've had some success. And that's why I say overall, I think it's good.
Well, I just want to say thank you. It's a thankless job, Dr. King. I just want to say thank you.
And I want to say thank you to you as well for your leadership in this area. And hopefully others will be influenced by it, who are in your position to help us forge toward a more just, inclusive, equitable, love-centered path to addressing, public safety in this nation. So again, thank you for your leadership, and thank you for taking time out to join us on our beloved community talks. We appreciate you.
Dr. King, I really appreciate everything that you do. And like I said, it wasn't for the King family, would you even be talking to Bill Scott, Chief of Police?
Right.
Bakari Sellers, attorney, state representative, national figure. I mean, look, we owe you a debt of gratitude. And Mr. Sellers, thank you for your work as well. Well, I admire you both, and I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to let you know what the officers here in San Francisco are doing.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. I like him.
I do. Me too.
Him. We got to duplicate him a little bit. We'll duplicate him around the country, don't we?
I know. I wish we could do it rapidly.
Yeah,
no, this is out of control.
It comes from the top, though, Dr. King, because he has a good mayor in London Breed, and a good, a good city council who are allowing him the ability to be a law enforcement officer, but still giving him the guardrails and the dollars necessary.
And I'm wondering how the young people in San Francisco feel about what he's doing, because I know there's a generational divide on which way we go forward around public safety.
Yeah,
it would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I think.
What grade do they give him? Because I mean, like you said, it's a thankless job. It's a necessary job, and we're not going to get it all right. But some kind of way, we've got to figure out how to reconcile, these points of tension in this area.
And I think that he said some of the right things. The restorative justice piece. I think even when you are, we literally in South Carolina and North Carolina, where I practice, even Georgia, where you reside, we have people who still are running around here with marijuana convictions on their record.
Yeah.
And they get convicted for simple possession of marijuana, which is a sugar packet. I'm in this hotel by the coffee maker, so I have to remind folk. I always like to remind folk what a marijuana charge is. This is a marijuana charge right here. That's how much. That is how much weed gets you a misdemeanor charge in most states. And when you think about it like that, you lose your driver's license, so you can't drive to work, so you get a DUS. You can lose your college scholarships. You can lose all of these things just because of someone not having that type of justice outlook. So shout out to the chief in San Francisco. We'll probably get in trouble from some folk for giving him props, but at least he's doing the right thing. Yes,
he is. So you want to introduce our next guest?
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure I get it right, because the team done sent me everything that I got. So I want to make sure. Here we go. I want to bring on to the stage. I'm the virtual stage as we are now. Mr. Farhang Heydari. Did I get that right? I hope I pronounced that right.
Farhang.
Farhang. Pronounce it again for me.
Farhang.
Nice to meet you. Blame that on my mind and not my heart.
No problem.
The executive director of the New York University School of Law's Policing Project. That's a dope project. I've seen a lot of the work and some of the resources that you all have put out. So first of all, thank you for all the work that you have done. This works with communities and police departments across the nation to ensure that police policies and practices are transparent. Good luck with that. I'm next.
No shortage of work.
Good luck, Mr. Good luck as well. My next guest is Mr. Sherrills. There you go. This is a unique title because they have you listed as a peace advocate, and I appreciate that. A mediator and spirit-centered activist. He works to promote healing in marginalized communities and community ownership of public safety, which is so very important because a lot of times people get consumed on social media or TV and they think these ideals are too big. They're for somebody else to tackle. So thank you for all the work that you all do.
Thank you.
I want to start with Mr. Heydari, if I can, if you don't mind. Tell us more about your project and how the initiative defines and describes public safety. Talk about what you see in this 21st century definition of public safety.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so first, thank you, Dr. King, the King Center, for having me here. It's an honor. Bakari, it's great to meet you. Thank you for having me. Public safety, I think for a long time, you ask people what public safety is, they might say freedom from gun violence or avoiding crime, that sort of thing. And that's true, that's part of it, but public safety is a lot more than that. It's an environment, it's having an environment where you can live and thrive. It's freedom from private gun violence, but it's also freedom from police violence. It's physical safety, but it's also mental and social and economic well-being. And when you think about public safety like that, then you realize police are only a part of the answer, and probably a really small part. People need resources, they need services, they need the conditions that allow them to thrive and be successful. And I think government has a lot to do there. I mean, the strategy of achieving public safety has to be owned by community, but it's one that has to be supported by government. I mean, government's the ones that they set up the parks, they fund the schools, they invest or don't invest in public transportation, they decide where the highways are built. And so all those decisions, they go into public safety, they create the conditions that we as a society tend to address with policing. And so at the Policing Project, we take a look at this fuller definition of public safety, and we try to tackle it in two ways. First, we think we've got to shrink the piece of public safety that we put on police, shrink this footprint of policing. A lot of the things I mentioned, we respond to them today with police, mental health calls, homelessness, all that. We respond with police. Maybe that's not the right job. And then the second tactic we take is, okay, we still think we need police. And Chief Scott was a great example of the kind of police we want. But those police, they have to be controlled. They have to be democratically accountable. So it's the two steps: shrink what police do, invest in other resources, and then control what's left of policing.
You know, you talked and you gave us a good outline of what public safety is, but one of the things I wanted to talk to you about are action items. And what are some of the essential steps that should be taken to have this comprehensive view on what you believe and what I believe and what everybody here believes public safety should be? I want people to be able to take something tangible from this. And honestly, I want both of you all to answer this question because I want people to be able to kind of take bites to go forward.
You know, there's no easy answer. You know, it's all about, you got to roll up your sleeves in your community and get there to public safety. If anyone tells you they have an easy answer, they're lying. But there's pieces that we know that work already. I mean, I want to hear about more what's happening in Newark, because we know that violence interruption work is a big part of that. We know that actually small investments in community organizations that go out there and interrupt violence can have a bigger impact than policing after the fact. We know that things like investing in summer job programs for youth can save more lives than going after, than just trying to police youth. And we know that investments in kind of needle exchanges can bring down deaths from drug use. We know that having Narcan available can bring down deaths. So it's all these little things. It's got to be part of a comprehensive conversation between community and government. So maybe that's not the full answer, but it's the pieces that we have so far.
Yeah, and I would just add that you have to have a ecosystem, you know, to support complementary strategies of public safety. As my brother said, you know, public safety is not just the absence of violence and crime. It's also the presence of well-being and the infrastructure to support victims and survivors in their respective healing journey. So for 25, close to 30 years, there has been a complementary strategy that has existed in urban neighborhoods all across the country. We used to call it gang intervention or street outreach or interrupters. But today we define ourselves as community-based public safety because it is an ecosystem. It's high-risk intervention. It's assertive outreach. It's victims advocacy. All of these systems working together, hospital-based violence intervention, trauma recovery centers. All of these systems basically work together as a complement to law enforcement. We used to think that you make an arrest and the problem is solved. But we now understand that there's a correlation between what happens in prisons and what happens on the street. You know, Raheem gets arrested, he goes to jail, he makes a phone call, he knocks somebody's head off on the street, you know? So this false narrative that we've been fed for over 100 years, that law enforcement is a single point of contact for safety in our respective communities, is just not true. We have to invest in the evidence-based practices that already exists, whether it be Cure Violence or the Professional Community Intervention Training Institute or Advanced Peace or the National Network of Safe Communities. All of these initiatives are functioning in multiple cities across the country and are seriously responsible for reducing violence and sustaining violence with law enforcement and without. Last year in LA alone, the Gang Reduction Youth Development Program, which is the city's funded community-based public safety initiative, about $11 million come out of the general fund to support this work, was responsible for reducing 41% of retaliatory homicides in the city of LA. And when you look at the investment, though, it's $11 million. LAPD's budget is $2.5 billion, right? Mm-hmm. $17.25 million to resolve one homicide in the state of California. So we have to incentivize peace. The community-based public safety practitioners, you know, our work on the ground has been highly, successful. Yet we talk about being data informed and data driven, right? However, we won't look at the data, in terms of how community-based public safety organizations are actually reducing violence and crime. In Newark, we've now had 6 consecutive years in a row of decreases of homicide and overall violence in the city. And this is because the mayor, in his genius, launched, the Newark Community Street Team as a complementary strategy. I don't say alternative because we're not trying to get rid of the police. As Chief Scott said, we're trying to invest in more procedural justice trainings and de-escalation strategies and healing for our cops, right? Because many of the officers on the Newark PD are sons and daughters of Newark, you know, and the high level of traumatic stress and hypervigilance that they experience on a daily basis. You know, the number one cause of police death is suicide, you know? So it speaks to something that is happening that is not, you know, necessarily community. We want our cops to get the proper counseling and therapy and whatever healing modality so that they can show up firmly rooted in their humanity and not, you know, project onto community some of the trauma and stress that they experience at home and also that they experience in the workforce.
So Aqeela, I want to ask you this question because I know there are a lot of people listening now, and both you and Farhang are solutionists, as my father was a solutionist. And I know that there are many people who want to kind of figure out how can I be part of the solution and not continue to perpetuate this problem. So what is it that we can all do to step in this area in terms of healing this issue around traumatized communities? As you just mentioned, I think the trauma is global. Yeah. And in light of that, if someone wanted to organize a peacemaking community street team, what would be the steps that they would need to take to do something like that? And who should be a part of that planning?
Yes. So some of the first steps that I think that folks need to take in terms of building out a community-based public safety initiative is that you organize a community, you know, around the concept and idea. You have to recruit the non-traditional leaders in the neighborhood. So those individuals that we traditionally view as the problem have to be seen as a part of the solution. So, you know, we hire ex-gang members, ex-convicts, ex-drug dealers. We train them consistently in conflict resolution, mediation, de-escalation strategies. We work through that public health lens. So we help people to understand that violence is a disease and it's a public health issue. And those who are closest in proximity to the issue need to be equipped with the skills, the tools, and the resources to intervene, to prevent, and to treat. So, you know, one of the things that we did in the city of Newark was that the mayor tapped me, bought me from LA, and charged me with building infrastructure, putting systems in place, and turning this initiative over to the local folks. So I you know, took a couple of evidence-based practices, safe passage, high-risk intervention, victims advocacy, and tied those pieces together. And we literally put out a job description and we recruited folks from the community. People came in, they applied for the job. We interviewed folks. We set up a system so that we have a corporate like infrastructure in terms of graduated disciplinary processes, and you know, we do terminate people and different things like that, but we don't have a corporate culture, right? Because many of our folks who we employ are highly traumatized and live in these neighborhoods in which they serve. And so we have to give folks 6 to 7 times, you know, chances. You know, like we come from the school of Donnie McClurkin. You know, people got to fall down. You know, right? Failure is a prerequisite for success. So, you know, that third time they learn how to tuck and roll and land back on their feet. And these individuals, they own the public safety paradigm and narrative in the community. You cannot have public safety without the public, right? So, you know, it's a organized and a concerted effort. It's not an easy task, you know, managing highly traumatized people. But when you when you tap into people's life purpose and their destiny force, and because people operate from a very emotional place, and you give them responsibilities and roles, you know, whether it be doing safe passage around the local schools, making sure our kids go to school and come home safely, whether it be responding, you know, to a victimization in the neighborhood, and you having the skill set to be able to connect somebody with victims comp or victim services in the state, filling out the application, doing referrals. I mean, these are all like career opportunities and paths that traditionally haven't been looked at as workforce development pieces. We started with 16 independent contractors. Today, the Newark Community Street Team is the anchor nonprofit in the South Ward. In 6 years, we've gone from being a $350,000 pilot program to be a $4.5 million agency with 50 staff. You know, wow. And in 2019, we had a negative 48% reductions in homicide in the South Ward, which traditionally was the most violent neighborhood in the city. And this is because the residents own the public safety narrative in the neighborhood.
Let me ask
law enforcement.
Let me ask a question to both of you all along that, because both of you all deal with data in different fashions. But we've been talking about restorative justice. We've been talking about reimagining public safety. We've been talking about redistributing, funds to both of you guys who deal in data from different ways. Does it work? I mean, what is the data showing you from communities who are doing this work? I want both of you guys who look at the data sets in different ways. One is research based. The other, if people are going to give you money at your nonprofit, you got to show that
that's right,
some success. So, we're having this entire program. Me and Dr. King believe it to work, but can you point us to some data points that show that it does work?
Absolutely. Farhang, you want to go first?
No, go ahead.
So in Newark, when we started our work in 2014, there were over 100 homicides in the city. And the mayor launched the Safer Newark Council, which was the coordinated body around public safety in the city. The Newark Community Street Team was born. We were boots on the ground in 2015. In 2016, we had double-digit reductions in homicide, 12%, in our first year of operation. In 2019, we had a 60-year low. We've now, 2 years, 2019 and 2020, we had 51 homicides, which was a 60-year low in the city. Newark had been on the top 10 most violent city list for almost 50 consecutive years. And so the data shows that complementary strategies, working with law enforcement in cities, coordinating our public safety approach actually reduces violence and crime, and it sustains the reduction. As I said, in the South Ward in 2019, we had a negative 48% reductions in homicide, and we're still trending down. Although violence is spiking all across the country, even 2020, violence spiked in most major cities all across the country. But in Newark, we remained flat. In addition, our officers didn't fire their revolvers, not once, and even during the George Floyd protests, we had over 12,000 people in the city protesting, expressing their anger and frustration with the system. But yet we had not one arrest because we have a coordinated strategy. Law enforcement was on the peripheral. Community-based organizations, the Brick City Peace Collective, the Newark Anti-Violence Coalition. We were all on the front line. We were engaging residents. We were engaging the agent provocateurs who were there simply to make havoc and potentially mess up the city, to let them know that, listen, Newark is still haven't fully recovered from the '67 rebellion. And, it's just not going to happen on our watch because, again, we have leadership. I like to say we have the 3 Ps lined up, right? We got the politics, we got the people, and we got the paper, we got the money. That allows us to be able to work together, to be able to have a major impact. And as a result, we're now exporting this strategy to multiple cities across the state and across the country.
Can I just add something to that? I can't do any better on the evidence around community-based violence intervention. I mean, Aqeela said it works, especially relative to how much it costs. But let me just talk about the flip side for a second. The way we do policing today in most parts of the country doesn't actually work. I mean, there are lots of places that are blessed with lower crime rates today than they had 20 years ago and 30 years ago. That's true. But the evidence shows the more you incarcerate doesn't necessarily actually make your communities any safer. We've had crime stay low in New York City, even when they massively dropped the number of arrests and stops and citations. We did a study in Nashville that looked at how the police department there was using traffic stops to try to fight crime and showed it doesn't actually help fight crime by just stopping a bunch of people. I mean, everyone here knows that because we've lived that world. We've had that experience. But those are the policing tactics that we sort of assume work, and they don't. In Boston, they stopped putting people in jail for a lot of low-level misdemeanors. Crime didn't spike. We've decriminalized low-level marijuana possession in a lot of places. Crime doesn't spike. And so it's important to think about the data that's behind community-based interventions, but it's equally important to think about the data and the evidence that's behind policing practices, because the truth of it is we just assume that police equate to public safety in a lot of situations. And that's not always the case. There are places where they're really helpful, and there are places where they actually do more harm than good.
Is this, and then, I'm sorry, Dr. King, but I wanted to do one more follow-up before we let them go, if you don't mind. But is this reform particularly out of touch? I mean, you run an entire institute on policing, and the reform we want. Is this something that is going to take a lifetime to get there? Is this something that could happen expeditiously? I mean, people want justice. They want it now, because I'm tired of Black bodies and Black blood being flowing in the street. And I know this is a difficult question for me to ask you, but reforming police, you know, we talked to the police chief in San Francisco. He's been doing this for 5 years. Talk to me about the timeline and what this looks like, how labor intensive, and when we can actually see change if we actually get all on the same page, which in itself is difficult.
I don't think it's going to be easy. And I also don't think we can leave it up to police departments to fix themselves. You know, when I think about immediate change, I think about all the things we could do right now. So we could have legislatures, city councils right now could stop the practices of pretextual policing. You know, right now, police departments could decide not to enforce low-level drug offenses. Right now, they could decide not to run warrant checks, not to enforce all those low-level warrants that are clogging up our system. So I think there's a lot of things we could do right now. It depends if there's a political will. The bigger change that we've been talking about, you know, shifting from a police department to a Department of Public Safety that supports community, that's generational change that we're all going to be working on. That's going to continue afterward. But I think the people who have failed us the most are our legislators. There is a list of proven practices, law reforms that they could enact today that would keep people alive. And there's just not the political will to do it in a lot of places.
And I would just say that we're essentially at an inflection point in this country in terms of public safety and public health. You know, never again should we see law enforcement as a single point of contact for safety in our respective communities. Reimagining public safety is not just about procedural justice training and more investment in de-escalation strategies for the cops. It's also about investment in community-based solutions like community-based public safety. You know, these institutions, as I said, have existed for close to 25 years. And we're nimble, we're on the ground. We have the ability to, you know, engage Pookie and Raheem and Fatima to resolve conflicts to a peaceful outcome, decreasing law enforcement need to respond, you know, to situations. You know, the data basically says that less than 1% of the population are producing like kind of 70%, you know, of violence and crime in cities, you know. So law enforcement should be really a targeted deterrent strategy, you know, more so than this. We want them to be coaches and therapists and teachers and lawyers and counselors. I mean, we put so much pressure on them to be everything without investing in those complementary systems, you know, that actually help to reduce violence and crime. Just recently, the Biden administration has decided to invest about $5.3 billion into community-based solutions, community-based public safety work, you know, and there's a lot of work that has to be done to move this through Congress and get it passed. And then, so that's a 6 to 8 month process, right, that we're currently working with. But the Treasury just came out with concise language yesterday for the ARP monies, the American Rescue Plan money, saying that these dollars can be specifically used for community-based intervention. So I want to challenge like governors and mayors and our Congress folks and our elected officials to take these dollars, invest them into based public safety initiatives, look at some of the models that already exist across the country, again, whether it be Cure Violence or Advanced Peace or the Newark Community Street Team, right? Allow us to come in your city and provide technical assistance and training, you know, to build the capacity of your agencies so that law enforcement is not by themselves out here in the community trying to do public safety, because they just can't do this alone.
Man, we need to have y'all on TV. They need to be, y'all need a whole night discussion. I thank y'all so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
If y'all hear it on TV, I may give y'all credit for it, may not, but you know, you guys are brilliant. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you.
Thank you so much for your investment.
so much.
Thank you so much. You know, as they were talking, you know, I just keep thinking about what my father was trying to help us do in 1967 when he wrote Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos of Community. And he talked about the need for a revolution of values. And, you know, the biggest issue we have in our nation now is really about values, you know, and you know, where do we put our resources in light of that? I mean, and until we have that revolution of values, this is going to be just this continuing tension going on. But then I thought about my mom, who said, you know, as I heard him talk, you asked the question about, you know, the length of time. I thought about what she said, you know, struggle is a never ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. You know, all of these issues that we're faced with, we're just going to have to be constantly vigilant because there are new generations that are coming along. And if we don't have the right value system that we're bringing people up in, it's almost like we are starting over again ever so often. You know, we make this progress and then all of a sudden we digress and then we're back to the same conversation.
But it reminds me that these aren't necessary. We're not necessarily having political discussions.
No, they're not political.
These are not discussions about whether or not you have a conservative or liberal ideology or whether or not we're having conversations about people's moral conscience, like what's right and what's wrong. And I think that we can win this battle. I mean, I just. But
we're having an economic conversation too.
Well, that's true.
Points that out. The data shows when you invest over here, you know, it's going to cost us less, certainly in the long term, probably even in the short term. So we just wow, we got a lot of work and digging in to keep doing. So, but I appreciate everything that they're doing. And as he said, invite him. You're listening now, and invite them to your cities. If that's something that's on your heart, you want to do something about reimagining public safety, police reform, what have you, know that it's a holistic approach. And what they're offering, you know, is community involvement in this approach. So don't hesitate to reach out to them for that resource, because I'm tired of us trying to reinvent the wheels too, Bakari.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes these things are being. I kept thinking while he was talking, and I'm glad he said later that they're trying to, you know, transport this to other places, because I kept saying, you know, if what you're doing is working, you know, why can't we just, you know, move it to somewhere else? Why do we always have to keep, you know, starting over in a new place when we got the model right here? But there's somebody else that's joined us tonight. He's our last guest, and I'm excited to have him tonight. Dr. Phillip Atiba Goff. He is the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity, which measures bias in policing. That the center works directly with police to measure behaviors and revise policies, and works closely with policymakers to prepare federal and state legislation, which is desperately needed. He's a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale University, became a national leader in the science of racial bias in pioneering scientific experiments that expose how our minds learn to associate Blackness and crime implicitly. That's a discussion in and of itself, often with deadly consequences. So let's welcome Dr. Goff to our discussion on tonight. Good to see you again, Dr. Goff. Glad to be with you. Wow. It's clear that law enforcement often responds more violently, aggressively, and inhumanely, and with more grave consequences than they do with white people. I've just been amazed as I've watched over and over again on video, the level of strain that is shown with white people versus Blacks. I know you studied racism and bias against Blackness within law enforcement and in society as a whole, but how is this connected to this kind of discrimination connected to our minds having learned to implicitly associate Blackness with crime?
Yeah.
And what are we going to do about it? That's what.
Yeah. So let's skip ahead to what we're going to do about it, because the reality is So much of the science of implicit bias we didn't need to do if we'd just been listening to Black folks in communities. I believe someone had a speech once where he said, someone told a lie one day, made everything Black low, everything white high. That's what we're talking about right now. Is it seeps into our language and the way that we describe things. We're in a dark period. I had a Black movement. All of those elements seep into the point where when you're seeing someone who's Black, you automatically associate that with the negative things in the world. But speaking of lies that somebody told, when we talk about trying to fix it, it's often the case that we think what's needed is therapy for the racists. And that's not really what we're talking about. I want to be clear. I'm a psychologist, and I don't think that therapy for racism is going to get us out of the places that we're at. I don't look at a dead Black body and think, oh, if only white people had better therapy. There are structures and systems that need to be fundamentally changed if we're going to prevent this. So the bias in some places, it's the symptom. It's not the root cause. The root cause is we have decided there are some people you can throw away.
Yeah.
And there are other people whose innocence, whose value needs to be championed and protected. So if you are underage by just 1 year and you've got an assault rifle and you travel across state lines, right, with the goal of protecting your identity, your group, your race, if that race is white, you'd be out of jail drinking underage on camera and not have your parole violated, not have your bail violated. But God forbid that you try and get your kids into a slightly better school, or that you go out and vote not realizing that your former incarcerated status means that you actually legally can't vote. You might be violated for 5, 6, 7 years. You might end up dead for expired tags. The point is the mission that we task folks with, and the bias comes after. Now that sounds like it's heavy. That sounds like it's bad news, but there's good news in it too, which is that if attitudes follow from behaviors, then the thing that we can observe is our salvation. That is, if we tell people, we're not going to let you do this. It's not going to be for you to respond to the folks who have mental health problems, the folks who have substance abuse issues, the folks who are homeless, the folks who are bought a pack of cigarettes and then resold those cigarettes individually. It's not going to be your job because you show up with a badge and a gun. We're going to have different people respond to that. All of a sudden, there's not a gun being introduced to a nonviolent situation. And looky here, nobody dies. If we focus on the behavior, we can end up changing the attitude. That's going to be salvation for all of us.
Wow.
Sometimes, I do say that Phil is one of the smartest brothers I know, just hands down. I mean, I just like hearing him talk many times. It calms my spirit. You don't understand the great deal of irony, Dr. King, because as I sit in my hotel room in Elizabeth City, I keep looking to the right out of my window because a protest for Andrew Brown Jr. is walking down the street, right? It's like we continue to live these cycles over and over again. My question to you, Dr. Goff, is this. Recently, my good friend Keisha Lance Bottom said that she wasn't running again for mayor of Atlanta. Shocked everybody. I don't know if she called Dr. King first and told her, but it shocked me, okay? And one of the reasons she said it was because of the drain that it had, that COVID crime spike had on hers. I'm friends with Randall Woofin in Birmingham and Frank Scott in Little Rock. But let's talk about how do we expect, or how should we expect first our communities to be policed during this crime spike that we're seeing in COVID. And then, the complicating factor of the public health issues that we're dealing with as a community. How can we come out of this talking about reform, talking about revitalization and reimagining public safety when it appears that public safety is needed at its most right now? Talk about that tension and how we unravel that.
Yeah, so within many activist communities, that word reform, it's getting thrown out. Not only is it getting thrown out, it's getting set on fire. Because the idea is that you can reform something that's fundamentally just and good, but just is malfunctioning. And the argument in many communities where we work is, no, it's functioning exactly as intended.
Yep.
So it's like we can't blow on the Nintendo game, right? You remember you used to blow on the Nintendo game and put it back in. It's not that.
No,
I got it.
It's not like the bottle of Tussin where you put some water in it. No, it don't work like that. It don't work like that. You're asking how should we do it in this particular time? One of the things that I was most concerned of, not this past March, but a year ago March, when we shut everything down, it was actually my wife and I, we gathered up her stuff on Friday the 13th. It's a very bad luck day. And I was real concerned when we came home that law enforcement would be an engine for spreading COVID. We didn't have PPE for them. And now I'm looking at the latest stat in the LAPD, and it looks like we got about maybe 51% who've chosen to go get vaccinated. What I think folks don't understand is that since we've already defunded hospitals, and we've defunded jobs, and we defunded schools, we defunded mental health, we defunded child welfare, the only thing we defunded in our most vulnerable communities, I should say, is law enforcement, which is why when you call 911, that's the one who's almost always coming. Unless something's on fire, somebody needs to go to the hospital. And even sometimes when somebody needs to go to the hospital, it's a black and white going to get there before an ambulance. So if we have our law enforcement refusing to get vaccinated, that's a terrifying moment. I mean, it's a terrifying moment. But again, there can be some good news in even this. Because when we think about what we should be doing, you talked about reform, and I said reform is a hard word. But there's another word I think we can be talking about that gives folks the power. I saw the panel right before this. Got two friends there that I respect a great deal, where we talked about public safety before law enforcement ever gets involved. And the word I want us to start using is reconstruction.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that word. So right after emancipation, after the Civil War is over, that's a period that historians refer to as Reconstruction. From 1867 to 1877 is the height of increase in Black wealth, in Black elected representation, and Black quality of life. Only lasted 10 years. Then there was a compromise in 1877. They took the military out of the South, and Jim and Jane Crow showed up. But if we think of the civil rights movement as we understand it as a second attempt to reconstruct the mythology of who we said we were, we're about due for a third reconstruction. And when we frame it as a third reconstruction, then we're not just talking about policing. We're not even just talking about public safety. We're talking about how do we remove from the body politic all of the toxins that are the residue of slavery and Jim and Jane Crow and government redlining and all the ways in which Black folks were shut out of the GI Bill, right? All of those elements where we didn't make good on the promises of democracy and everybody be created and treated equally. How do we start over to make good on the things that we say that we value? That's how we should be thinking about public safety in that full context. Because I tell you, if we fix everything that we got to do in policing, even if we remove police from the places where they shouldn't be, and we don't set up the schools and the hospitals and the jobs, we're going to be right back where we started in the beginning. Because this is a broad need to include Black and brown and Native folks in the project of democracy the way that we should have been included from the beginning. And every time we fail Reconstruction, we are building things we're going to have to burn to the ground.
Yeah. I was just talking, I'm sure you heard me earlier with Bakari about when my father talked about the revolution of values. And one of those things is that we have to quickly shift from being a thing-oriented society to a person-centered society. And I hear that's what you're saying, how do we truly invest in those places where there's a deficit related to people? But I want to ask it's actually a couple of questions. They're not directly related to each other, but they do impact this discussion. I have a friend that went through a training. I think it was about a year, maybe a year and a half or so ago, with the FBI. And he called me and said, B, I mean, I can't believe it. The FBI, they giving me this information. They got the data where, the white supremacists have infiltrated, many of our law enforcement across this country. I want you to talk about that because you've developed a policy plan for policing in America called White Supremacy and Policing, how law enforcement agencies can respond. Because there's some people that are probably listening now that don't even know that. And we need to be aware of that element as it relates to reimagining. But on the other hand, how do district attorneys and attorney generals factor into this? I mean, when we think about the George Floyd verdict, we have to give a great deal of credit outside of all of the activism that took place to Attorney General
Keith Ellison, yeah.
Yes, Ellison. So talk to us about those two important elements as we talk about reimagining policing outside of the investments that everybody keeps talking about, that when we really invest, in people's lives, in their quality of life, when people feel included in society, a lot of things that we try to use, policing for begins to diminish.
Yeah. So on the first question about white supremacy infiltrating law enforcement and the FBI, right? There has been for some time, for now, almost a full 2 decades, an attempt amongst white supremacist organizations to become part of the armed representatives of the state. That's a mess. It's just straight up a mess. But the question isn't why they would want to be part of it, because it makes sense. You have a group that feels that they're marginalized. They want to have access to state power and the license to use physical coercion to get what they want. The question should be, why on earth has it taken so long for them to stick out? And how many aren't sticking out in the first place? What have we done in these communities that we've said, all right, I guess the mission of law enforcement is enough aligned with these folks' values that we didn't notice? That should be the wake-up call, right? I'm gonna tell you right now, I run a nonprofit of not quite 100 people. It's a growing organization. You might be able to sneak one white supremacist in if they scrub their social media and they didn't say what they believe. But two get together in a break room, I'm gonna tell you, we're gonna catch them real quick. Right? Like you can't show up to a racial justice organization, to an organization whose job it is to make sure that people are staying alive and be like, yeah, but a little bit white power? No, that doesn't happen. So part of what we need to do is we need to make sure that law enforcement understands that one of their principal responsibilities is not just to the Constitution as written, but also to the mission and the spirit, right? It's not just to the written law, but to the spirit of the law, which says equality is a value that has to be first amongst principles. And that's not just a vague thing. You ask questions, you ask for affiliations. For instance, in many cities, if you are affiliated with, if you hang out with folks who have a felony record, you cannot be law enforcement. And yet you can go to a little campfire shaped like a cross, dressed in white sheets, and show up. Well, you create a policy. That's it. A policy that says you must come forward with those known affiliations. If you lie, you're terminated immediately. I don't need a review. There's no collective bargaining that can get you your job back. If you are in any way affiliated with these sets of known groups, you don't get to carry a badge and a gun and the name of the city behind you. That's first. But to your second question of the importance of prosecutors and attorneys general, 1,000%. DOJ, and we need to confirm Kristen Clark for the Civil Rights Division at DOJ federally, but DOJ can only do so much. Even if we quintupled the lawyers in the Special Litigation Division, they'd only be able to do maybe 3, maybe 5 investigations a year. So it's got to happen at the state and the local level. And the more that we make these issues a priority, the better we're going to see it happen. The more that it's removed from folks investigating themselves, the easier it is for public pressure to say this must be held accountable to the values that we have as an organization. But even within all of that, even within all of these elements of we got to make sure the white supremacists stay out, we got to make sure that the AGs and the district attorneys are in and doing the right sets of things, nothing will replace, as Aqeela was saying, nothing will replace giving the power back to the people. This is not about how we keep communities safe. It's how communities keep themselves safe. And all we can do from outside those communities is give communities the tools. The Center for Policing Equity, we are a tool for communities. We are not coming in on a white horse trying to save nobody. We come with a toolkit and we get to work. That's the way all of us have to treat democracy.
Dr. Goff, I know we're wrapping up, but before we wrap up, you said something earlier I just want to come back to because people need action items. And you said that, you're burning reform. So what do we do right now? I know you're talking about community-based everything, but what do we do right now with the current law enforcement we have, the current city council we have? What are some of the, briefly, because they're telling me we're going to commercial break in my ear over here. So briefly, What are some of the things that people can do right now with the structures that are in place? I don't want them to feel helpless and hopeless.
No. So I would say the two sort of core principles I want everybody to have, right? The first one is strap in, because this is a generational fight, right? And the second one is do anything. Show up. Because the local stuff is just a few folks who are getting a lot of things done. And I want to point to one place in particular where the most radical change I've seen in my lifetime, Ithaca, New York, where over the course of 9 months, they said, we don't want a police department. We want a department of community solutions to public safety, majority unarmed, civilian-led, and no armed response to nonviolent crises. It's what activists have been looking for. It's what law enforcement are in support of. And the people did that. But the first step, show up. Get to know how your city works and get engaged. I swear, you do that for a couple of weeks at a time, you'll become expert way faster than listening to anybody else.
And just please tell us, along with that, how critical it is to pass this George Floyd Justice in Policing Act.
On two levels, it is absolutely essential. On the one level, this is a national problem, so we need national leadership on it. Like we just need to hear that and see that. But on the other level, what it gives, it arms DOJ with more tools to help local communities out. Lowering the 242 standard for me is the biggest portion of it, which literally
thank you. Amen to that. Between qualified immunity and 242, you got it. Thank you.
242 all day, every day.
Wait a minute, say 242 again.
It's the 242 standard. It's what allows Civil Rights Division to come in and say, yes, we're going to hold you accountable. And right now, it's willful. You have to say, I didn't just kill you because you're black. I killed you because you're black, and I don't like black people. If that's not written down, you can't move forward.
Right.
If it's reduced to reckless, it says, you know what? If that was some stupid stuff you did, you have a badge and a gun. You should know better, and we can get involved. So and there's many other things getting put in, stuff for mental health, stuff for street violence reduction. It's great. It's absolutely crucial. So please, yes, I think that you have on the scroll, support the George Floyd Justice Policing Act. There it is right there. Call folks because it absolutely needs to happen. It should be bipartisan because this shouldn't be about partisanship. This is a moral values issue.
Wow. Well, we could keep talking to you all day and you can continue to educate us. And I just want to thank you for all of your hard and strategic work that you're doing in this area that is so critical. And thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us on the Beloved Community Talks platform.
I mean, this is the work, and I'm honored to be here, humbled to be here, and I appreciate y'all lifting all this stuff up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Whew.
That was a lot. It is a lot. I was trying to think about which one was my favorite, but I got something out of each of them, and that's rare. You know, when you have panels, sometimes you get a favorite. Dr. Goff was brilliant. The two individuals in the middle just talked about real life data that we need to go forward. And I love the police chief as well.
Yeah, I think they were all critical to this conversation. And I'm hoping that this has inspired people to continue this conversation in their communities. Because as we know, law enforcement is very local. And it is very critical that we pass the George Floyd, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act at the national level, which certainly will help strengthen whatever is done at the local level. But we need everybody's involvement and engagement in not just this issue, but the whole issue around equity in our communities. I want to say something that Ambassador Young mentioned to me in recent times, because we know as it relates to HR 1, HR 4, the voting rights legislation, that's, well, I guess one of them is SR now, SR 1, I think, which is in the Senate. And facing the filibuster. And he kept saying, you know, we got to figure out how to be strategic and finding 10. He kept saying, we got to find 10. And what he was saying is that there is a history in our democracy of bipartisan legislation passing, but it takes a lot of work. And I'm not saying people are not doing the work.
A lot of work.
but we on the ground, the citizens of the United States, have to be a little bit more strategic as well. And so while I want to encourage everybody to call their senators to encourage them to support this policing act, because you're from all over the United States, perhaps you're from other places in the world. We have friends that are in districts where we know senators are either on the line, they're up for re-election. Some of them may not be running for office again, who right now may not support this act because it's known that most of those who are Republican don't. But we got to put some pressure there too, because if somebody tells me to call my senator right now, both of my senators support it. So it's like, okay, what do I do next? Because there's no need of me making that call. So what is my next action? So we got to cross some of these lines and help with the pressure points in other places so that we can get all of these things passed in Congress. But as it relates to this conversation about reimagining public safety, we've gotten a lot of insight into what is happening in so many different cities in this country. Some of which I hope is, as you said, replicated, duplicated, followed, that it inspires some action in other places. And I hope people will leave here tonight with that in mind, that this was not just a conversation to get information, but this was an activation night. That I'm good. Yes, yeah, you know, that's what he said. What did he say? Strap it and do anything.
That's right.
And I'm amazed. I'm going to go look up this whole situation with Ithaca. And we know every city, every town, has its own unique set of circumstances. But there's some fundamental things that we talked about here tonight. This is about people. They serve us. Law enforcement serves us. It's not the other way around. And we are the ones to help with the shaping of what this looks like when we talk about reimagining public policy. He said it, you can't do it without the public. That's the whole point. And so we're all a part of that public, and we need to get busy. So thank you, Bakari, again, for taking a moment and breaking away from the critical work that you're doing there in Elizabeth City.
It's been crazy, but I want to say that I am more fulfilled, more energized, and more activated being a part of this. And I always try to leave the people here in Elizabeth City who come out and support Andrew Brown and his family something to do. And this has activated me to give them something to do. So shout out to Prawn Hill and Tara Gay and Bonita Hampton Smith and Gerald Perry and everybody behind the scenes who worked with me to make this possible. And of course, you, Dr. King, always for your love, support from afar.
Thank you. And please give our love and prayers to the Brown family and to the sons. I know that feeling. I could talk on that for quite some time. But my prayers are with them. And thank you once again for joining us. We're going to close, but I don't want to close without letting you know about something very important that we have embarked upon here at the King Center. It's called Be Love. It's a Be Love campaign. Actually, it's becoming a movement. People all over the world are connecting with us because we have got to change the tenor and the tone and the manner of the way in which we engage, the way in which we create and set policy in this nation, and the way in which we address our differences. And so Be Love is elevating a conversation and activism around how love can help us to implement demands of justice and how love can help us to correct everything that stands against love. These are notions that have been inspired by my father's words that bring together power and love and justice into one force. And we're talking about a love that is powerful, that it's transformative, that is, it helps to awaken and open you to understanding our human connectedness and becoming more compassionate and understanding and beginning to look with clean and pure eyes at all of the things that are impure and unjust and unequitable in our world and have a fierceness about your urgency to correct those things, to rid our society of the toxic poisons that are tearing us apart as humanity. And so please join us on this journey that we are learning together. What is this love because it's powerful. It's not weak. It's not anemic. It's not conditional. It is unconditional. It finds a way to leave you with your dignity, even when I disagree with you adamantly. And then looking at revolutionary love, and then looking at reconciliatory love that does not deny justice and truth as part of the process in healing. Come with us on that journey through our trainings. Come with us on that journey by going to our website, taking the pledge, and going through our trainings. And we'll have more and more trainings, and we'll be calling you forth as we look at these pieces of legislation that have to be corrected in our society and superintended, as my father said, because you just can't pass legislation and not have some superintendent of the legislation, because it will not achieve what we passed it for. And so join us in that effort. Be Love at thekingcenter.org. We have the Nonviolent Philosophy and Methodology training that we're doing along with this as well. And so I invite you to learn more about it. Take that pledge, register for the virtual series so that we can implement the demands of justice, including what we talked about tonight in public safety. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank our team who pulled all of this together, our production team. You don't see their faces, but I could not do what I'm doing tonight if they did not play their most critical parts. And so I want to thank all of them, the names that Bakari called out earlier, who helped pull all of this together. And I want to thank Bakari for co-hosting this with me, and for all of our guests for the work that they're doing in our nation around public safety. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining tonight from wherever you are, or today. It could be today. You might be somewhere in the world where it is daylight still, or it's morning time. So I will say to you, as we close on tonight for me, this evening for me, I look forward to seeing you again through some of our trainings. I'm going to be a part of the one in June. I just want to give that a shout out in case you want to join. But join us on the journey and in the mission of trying to create this beloved community, which is a more just, or a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. And I say to you, continue to be safe and have a good evening, a good night, or a good morning, wherever you are. I'm Bernice King, CEO of the King Center, and I bid you be love. Love. Now, I know many of you saying, what do you mean by love? Because people have so many different understandings of love. What I am talking about is not the powerless, the weak, and the anemic love. No, no, no. I'm talking about be love and implement the demands of justice. Be love and use your power to correct everything that stands against love. The urgency of now is to dig in and create the beloved community by rising up to be love. Let's go forward in this moment and bridge the divides. Let's go forward to create the beloved community. Let's go forward and rise up to be love. Hi, I'm Bernice A. King, CEO of the King Center, and yes, the last born of MLK Jr. and CSK. And I want to take this moment to invite you to join us in our Be Love campaign. Now, wait a minute. I know you may be thinking that I'm talking about something weak and sentimental. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the kind of forceful, powerful, courageous, and transformative love. I'm talking about the love that my father said can help us to implement the demands of justice. And yes, that same love that can help us to correct everything in our society and world that stands against love. So why don't you join us on the journey and log on to thekingcenter.org and take the pledge, and let's all learn how to be love so that we can create a more just, humane, equitable, peaceful, and even sustainable world.